Welcome to the WAN Manager Podcast. I'm your host, Greg Bryan, and this is the show where we talk to networking experts about the data services that make business possible. So if you've been a longtime listener to the show, you might recall that last year, my colleague Elizabeth Thorne on the enterprise team here at TeleGeography and I did our WAN year in review. Is that what we're going to call it?
Yeah, the year in review.
Yeah, there we go. All right. 2020 was an interesting year, of course, and 2021 kept that going. As I recall, we talked a lot about how there were no conferences and how that affected us. There were no conferences again this year for us anyway. There was the London Summit.
There was.
One of our colleagues went to. Fingers crossed that we'll be going to Dusseldorf for March WAN Summit there, and New York in May or June. Maybe others, maybe other conferences in general. We'll see.
Fingers crossed.
Certainly would make both of our lives a lot easier. So, but that said, we still got a lot done this year. There's plenty to cover in the WAN space, and we wanted to do a kind of whirlwind tour because Lizzie came up with an excellent list for this, and my first comment was, there's a lot to cover. So,
there is. Last year, I don't think we got to everything on our list either. We did not.
Yeah, that may, again, if you see this on video, and we'll have little video clips, we don't release the full show in video, we are together in the office in downtown DC. We're having our holiday party today, so hopefully everyone will refrain from partying until we're done recording. But yeah.
I've heard that the party's going to start at lunch. So
all right.
Time's ticking.
Well, yeah, let's go. Let's get to this. All right. So, yeah, welcome, Lizzie. Thanks for joining us again this year.
Of course. Always happy to be on.
And I thought we'd start just with what you've been up to of late. So, because it's probably going to inform a lot of what we're talking about, right? So,
absolutely. Well, I've been nose to the grindstone working on our WAN Manager Survey Report for 2021. Yet again, this year, we surveyed global WAN managers across various industries on their network topology and what they're thinking about some of the top trends in the WAN space. This year, that was network security and zero trust security and sort of secure access service edge, or SASE, a term that's been spread around quite a bit in the past year or two.
Yeah, we didn't have that clear of an idea when we started the WAN Manager Survey in 2018 how it would go, but we've sort of alternated between SD-WAN check-ins on the even years and security check-ins on the odd years. Probably keep that going because I'm sure we plan to update SD-WAN next year. So we have a time series in security to some extent, although SASE wasn't a word when we did our 2019 surveys.
No, this is interesting. We'll get into this more in the future, but I still kind of prefer using the term zero trust security, at least when talking to WAN managers about these things, because as far as I've seen, SASE is much more of a vendor term, right? It's about the kind of merging of SD-WAN and cloud-based network security into kind of one product, versus for WAN managers, most of what they're thinking about is, okay, how can I adopt zero trust security policies and make my network more secure?
Right. How do people get into my network and what can they do when they do isn't really SASE per se, although I guess
it's an element of
SASE. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. But not the one that the IT infrastructure manager is as concerned with, probably. So, all right. Well, like I said, you gave us a great outline for things that we should talk about from 2021. You want to kick us off? What did you think was the most sort of salient issue in 2021 networking?
I think top of the mind for everyone is remote work and what the future of the office worker is going to look like in 2021 and beyond. So hybrid schedules, people coming in to the office a couple days and working remote for the rest, or going fully remote in the long term, is something that WAN managers are going to have to be thinking about, both in terms of their network procurement for their sites and in terms of securing and optimizing the end user, the remote end user experience. So that's something that definitely a lot of people were thinking about and talking about.
Right. So kind of two separate streams. One, what's the impact on the office and what I should do there? And then two, how do we keep, everyone just had to put sort of emergency measures that have now, stretched into years. And so it's becoming clear that that those emergency measures become permanent solutions, right? And they probably weren't done optimally for most people, right? So
exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
In fact, I was just talking to someone earlier today about this impact of, if now that people are returning to the office, we are in our office. We've been coming in periodically now and then, but we'll almost certainly stick to a schedule that is very much like what most of the corporate knowledge worker world is looking like, of a few days at home, a couple of days in the office, something like that. But we're getting into that world where everyone uses things like this. We have a TV with a webcam on it. So we've been doing this at TeleGeography for a long time, but it might be new for a lot of organizations to not, forego picking up the handset and instead be using these UCaaS tools that are much more bandwidth hungry. Mm-hmm. It's still the case that the typical MPLS size is like around 20 megs or so.
Yeah, or less.
Yeah, right. In fact, we probably will talk about that bandwidths are skewing lower for MPLS than they had been, and higher for internet, which is part of this problem, right? That it probably doesn't make a whole lot of sense to run your Teams or Zoom meeting over your MPLS circuit, right?
Right. That's kind of an interesting phenomenon to watch. I think when this very first started, we were kind of looking at it like, oh, well, maybe this means in the future bandwidth, like WAN managers will be able to decrease the amount of bandwidth they're provisioning for offices if there's going to be less people in. But actually, it seems like kind of the opposite is happening, because so many companies have adopted Zoom, like you said, and other UCaaS tools. When they do return to the office, they're actually probably going to be using even more bandwidth than they had in the past. Right.
But probably not MPLS, which I assume we'll talk about too. Yeah, we will later. So, yeah.
Well, that's the other thing is that, the sort of leap into working remote and everything going over the internet for a lot of people, residential internet, was kind of a proof of concept of you can run video conferencing just over broadband or, other internet services, and it'll work 90% of the time, which is good enough.
Yeah. And people are, I think there's just a cultural change of people are fine with good enough, or,
Yeah, exactly. Change of expectations.
Yeah, exactly. Now, the other thing that you had listed here, which I think is really worth talking about, I'm thinking about this a lot because I'm working on our market sizing model that tries to understand the dollar value of the WAN market globally. And so you have to figure out how many offices are there in the world.
Yeah.
And it's, historically unusual to have a decrease in the number of offices. If you look up people with assumptions from real estate economics and stuff like that, no one knows quite what to do. We have personally talked to some WAN managers who said they have heard from their bosses that they might be shutting offices down. I looked at some outside research from, various research firms like McKinsey and PwC that said definitely some managers are thinking about shutting down offices. So the WAN IT infrastructure teams might have fewer places to connect. Yet at the same time, then your endpoints are also multiplied greatly because every office you shut down, has. And I think something also even maybe slightly different than that, which is that there might be a general decentralization toward smaller offices in more, sort of, I don't know, tier 2 or 3 cities that you didn't see before, which if that is a result of this all, just because a lot of people have been moving away from the sort of, now that they are untethered from a particular job market, they've been moving to, in the U.S., non-coastal locations and stuff like that, right? I'm sure similar trends everywhere else. And that's going to have an effect of some additional challenges for the IT infrastructure teams. If your management is looking for cheaper real estate, either in the exurbs or maybe even in a tier 3 city or something, then all of a sudden you're not necessarily dealing with the same set of providers that you're used to, or having to change your strategy there. We all know that broadband and DIA especially are kind of difficult to procure in some less served markets. So.
Right, especially if you're coupling this with an SD-WAN deployment or general hybrid networking, you're going to have to start really looking at the internet diversity in some of these places.
Right, which I think if we get to it, we'll talk about 5G later too, so that'll be fun.
Yeah. I do think this is one of those things where it's not necessarily going to sneak up on people because real estate is a pretty slow-moving beast, and many places are locked into like 10-year leases.
Right.
That's more like the average time span for these sorts of things. So this is definitely going to be something we see play out over time. But I think for many companies, the intention is there.
Right. Yeah. And I mean, same in the network space that, especially if you're still in an MPLS kind of contract, it's probably 3 or 5 years. So it's not like you could immediately turn down your MPLS. But ultimately, I still think we've seen some movement there. So we'll talk about that. Now, you mentioned SD-WAN. So let's move to there. We didn't check in on SD-WAN this year. That was in our 2020. But we have reason to believe that SD-WAN is probably in about the majority of the market now, right? So
yeah, in 2020, we found that just over 40% of our respondents had installed SD-WAN on their networks, which was like a pretty sizable increase from 2018, where it was like maybe more closer to
18%.
Yeah, 18%. So that was a pretty sizable increase. And additionally, many more people, the majority of our respondents were sort of in the pipeline for installing. So we can imagine that, in the past year, many of them have completed or, at least partially completed their SD-WAN installments.
Yeah, for sure. I think that it's probably safe to say that at least among the type of enterprises that we talk to, that caveat, right? 'Cause people who don't pay attention to surveys and conferences and whatnot may be behind, but there's probably something like a majority of the market that has adopted SD-WAN. What about how they're getting SD-WAN? So it changes from the DIY model, which was like very, very common, definitely a strong plurality when we first looked into it. Has that shifted? Are they going more for the full kind of service stack from a carrier or an MSP or something?
Yeah, there definitely has been a shift there, both on the enterprise side and in terms of what the vendors are offering. Many of the first adopters of SD-WAN were doing it, straight with the SD-WAN vendor themselves. And there were 2 reasons for that. One was because a lot of these first adopters had...
That's all there was.
This is all there was. Yeah. If they tried to go to their carrier, the carrier didn't really know what they were talking about or didn't have those sorts of relationships established yet. And also some of these first adopters were more likely to have a sizable WAN team who could manage an SD-WAN deployment on their own and do all of that design and deployment, versus now, in 2017, when we started covering the SD-WAN market, there were only 11 managed SD-WAN service offerings. And in 2021, we've seen 80 managed SD-WAN providers. So that's a pretty huge maturation in the market.
Yeah, like all the carriers have gotten in on it. The SIs, the sort of business outsourcing IT groups of the world have gotten in. Some, even kind of small providers that are really sort of focused on maybe the mid-market and getting them SD-WAN and stuff like that.
Yeah, exactly. So what that means is it's more options for enterprises who maybe don't have the in-house capability to go DIY and manage and deploy everything themselves, now have that option available to them. So I think we'll see an even greater expansion of SD-WAN into the general enterprise and mid-market as a result of this.
Yeah, one thing I'm really curious about when we update those data for, whatever Q2 of 2022 is to see what the I don't want SD-WAN group looks like. Because it was in 2018, it was almost no one, because it would be unlikely by then that you would have like evaluated it and decided against it. There's a handful. By 2020, it was like a little bit less than 1 in 10, still a very small minority. So it'd be interesting to see if there's any, and we've talked to some. We've had some interviews with someone who said, "Yeah, I looked at SD-WAN. It's not for us." That tends to be more the enterprise that works almost like a small carrier, like where they have a very large sourcing team, and maybe they even have like a lot of point-to-point service and stuff like that. And so it's out there, but I think it'll remain a very small part of the market. so.
Well, so there's that that contingent of people where like they're so large that, they might not even want to be running broadband necessarily. But then you also have kind of the exact opposite of that,
right.
which is
internet is good enough.
Where they're like, maybe we just can run everything over the internet with some cloud-based security protocols and, essentially adopt the approach that many small and medium-sized businesses have been using for a while now, like such as TeleGeography.
Yeah,
we don't have a WAN. We do everything
Google
over
Suite, and you have your security. But yeah, exactly. So you don't really have a WAN, and that I think that may work for a particular type of vertical, maybe kind of in the technology area of some kinds of technology companies, but probably never going to be a good solution for most of the kind of like global 5,000 enterprises that we look at. But they'll be out there, I'm sure. So on that, with the internet only WAN, I think internet only without SD-WAN is going to be a very small minority. Even still, internet only with SD-WAN is still not that huge of a group, but we've definitely seen the decline of MPLS in real data. Tell us about that. And this one surprised me even at like, because we've been telling the story for a long time. It's always nice to see the curve that you've drawn out in your forecast kind of match what the reality becomes.
So in our most recent 2021 network survey data from the WAN Manager Survey, we see MPLS for the first time went below 50% of average sites in the respondent network. It was 46% of respondent sites, and then DIA is catching up. It's at 44% of respondent sites. That is a huge change from just 4 years ago, where MPLS was at a strong majority of sites, like 80%.
Yeah.
And then DIA was like maybe 20%. So we're definitely seeing that convergence happening in real time.
Yeah, and this is, of course, an average. There's some out there with 100% of MPLS and some with zero MPLS. But it kind of gives credence to that model that is one of our hypotheticals that I'll be writing about early next year, of like the sort of tiered networks. Okay, I'm keeping MPLS at my core important sites, headquarters, large branch offices, but alongside a DIA maybe as the other active connection, whereas before I might have had two MPLS ports.
Exactly. We see it also reflected when we ask people about their MPLS backups for those who still have MPLS. 4 years ago, it was most common to have an active MPLS setup with having active passive MPLS being the next most common. And now the most common backup solution is to have alternative connectivity services. Like you might have MPLS as your active line, but then you would have DIA or broadband or even mobile as your secondary line, giving you that redundancy. And that can potentially allow people to kind of drastically cut their MPLS spend while still maintaining MPLS at the sites that they need them.
Yeah, I end up saying this to a lot of our benchmarking customers, whether we're talking from really either side of that market, the carrier side or the enterprise side, which is that, sort of the thing that surprises people is that if you can get rid of those MPLS backups, an MPLS backup always has to have its own local access line, fully redundant. That's a pain for the carrier to source, or it's expensive for the enterprise to pay for that pass-through cost. And so just being able to free yourself from the MPLS backup, even if you kept MPLS at 100% of sites and didn't change anything about your network, you could lower the cost of it, because a DIA or broadband connection especially is very likely to be cheaper than having that MPLS redundant connection. So
and one more thing I found interesting in the data is in 2018, almost 1 in 4 respondents who had MPLS had no backup for their MPLS at all, and that has gone down drastically to like less than 10%. So the ability to have a fairly cheaper backup line actually increases the amount of redundancy that you're able to source for your network for some people.
So that fulfills that promise of SD-WAN to improve not just like your application performance, but your network resiliency. Even if you're in the MPLS world, you can improve your resiliency without adding too much additional cost. We'll see the network stuff. I mentioned that we alternate SD-WAN and security, the network stuff we cover every year. So we should be able to get a picture next year if DIA overtakes MPLS as the most common WAN product. I'm pulling for it. We'll see. I don't have a horse in that race, but it really is interesting to see that, especially a few years ago, a lot of people were kind of making the argument of like, oh, MPLS is dead. We sort of took the sort of middle of the road approach of like, oh, it's going to decline. It's not going to disappear. And that seems to be what's happening, right? That so people still have a use for MPLS and might for a very long time. Although, if I recall correctly, in a lot of the interviews we did in conjunction with the survey, we heard more than one person say, we still have MPLS because I couldn't sell my bosses on getting rid of it. But after a couple of years of running SD-WAN and having everything go smoothly, we might jettison MPLS. Is that a sentiment that you think we've heard fairly often?
Absolutely. Yeah. I think some people are pleasantly surprised at how well DIA can work, right. Especially with load balancing. If you have two different lines going where they're both, like neither one is particularly prioritized, you might actually see traffic naturally moving over to the DIA connection. Though I will say in terms of reasons that you might keep MPLS around on your network, we've heard a variety of things. Some people need it for their telephony. They still have hard phones in their offices. Some might need it for certain regions like China.
Right.
We talked to some people where they might have plans to have a full, SD-WAN with internet network across the globe, but then the one exception is China. So.
And there's a couple of the difficult markets, but yeah, as a matter of fact, in my hypothetical scenarios that I'll be writing about next year early, I never got rid of the MPLS in China and a couple of other hard markets. And China is its own thing, but there's also, if you have sites in, say, Africa, for example, a local ISP in Africa might be really problematic for various reasons. I don't know if on your list we have to talk about the middle mile. Yeah, we do. So we might hit that a little bit more there. But, if you have a local ISP that operates in a single or a couple of markets, say, in the developing world, that traffic might have a bunch of different hops and peering arrangements and everything between that and the first mile, right? Because your cloud service provider might not be super close to some of those more. So I think we'll see MPLS stick around in some of those more difficult markets because there's someone that's responsible for that traffic there, So, and in the U.S., you know what I mean? There are difficult places in the U.S. in that sense as well. Or you just have, industries that can't give up on that kind of classic carrier grade SLA and, class of service needs for certain kinds of applications that haven't exactly been fully cloudified for the public internet. And
right. We talked to one person in an interview where they were planning on going full DIA in their network, and then they work with the government, and the government released new regulations, so then they had to kind of roll that back.
Yeah, exactly. So there's going to be a lot of you can sort of view these things too much through the lens of the network architect in terms of what would just make sense from a technological perspective doesn't always make sense on the ground with the market realities or regulatory realities such as they are. So. Yeah, well, on that, compliance and reporting and whatnot ends up under the security team a lot. We asked a bunch of questions about security this year, again, kind of squashing together some of our time series questions about zero trust with SASE elements. What did we find out? Because I'll be honest, I haven't read this yet, so I'm going to have to really rely on you. So.
Oh, yeah. No. Well, so the biggest thing we probably found is just that there's zero trust security, which if listeners aren't necessarily familiar, basically means, never trust, always verify in your network rather than having, your kind of castle and moat where users use their password or credentials to get in and then they kind of have access to many things horizontally across the network.
Like the managed access, like a user. You're not once you break through the wall, you're into the network, but this is still like every application is managed, which is a big task to change over from those.
It is, and there's lots of different things that fall under that umbrella. It's not necessarily like a single product. It's it's more of a security philosophy. But given that, we found that zero trust security principles and just kind of awareness of those principles is much more prevalent among our enterprise respondents. We first asked about this in 2019, and at that time, it was like only 9% of respondents had implemented some sort of zero trust security in their network, and that has risen to just over 1/3 of respondents. Yeah. Of course, again, that can mean so many different things.
Right, because we're just saying if you've implemented maybe one or two elements of zero trust or SASE, then you would answer that. So among that third who have, it's probably very few who have a kind of full SASE stack totally
exactly,
implemented, right?
Yeah. So, like when we really drilled into what features they had actually implemented, the two most common by far were multi-factor authentication and single sign-on. Right. And then when you ask people, okay, well, how did you do that? A lot of it was literally like, oh, well, we use like Office 365 and we use the login through that. We use Active Directory.
Duo or something.
A lot of it came from using the services that were already available through the incumbent technology.
I mean, that's really interesting, right? Yeah. I mean, it was the same thing with UCAS developing for the enterprise. I remember going to a conference many years ago, like let's say 5 years ago, and here's Skype for Business and Cisco Jabber, and it's like, these are the consumer tools I've been using for 10 years, right?
Exactly.
That are born on the internet, that work on the internet, which is part of driving all of this, sort of movement away from MPLS or whatever. But it takes a long time for the technologies that we're all familiar with as just individual users to get to that enterprise grade or whatever. But you're indicating something that's, I think, really worth highlighting there, which is that I have an element of ZTS or SASE implemented, but it's just through my cloud providers anyway, right?
I thought it was really interesting because so much of what we see driving people towards SD-WAN and the internet and everything, it's literally using Office 365 or other enterprise cloud tools. And to see that kind of replicated as well in the zero trust security space, I just found so interesting. Mm-hmm. And then on the flip side of that, like I said, there's lots of different things that fall inside of zero trust security, and some of them are way more bespoke. You could say like you actually have to do it yourself. Right. And the biggest one of that is probably network segmentation, which is, looking at the different data lakes and silos in your network and determining, who can access what and making sure that, some confidential data is not sitting in the same place as something else that other people are accessing where they shouldn't be accessing the confidential stuff, or all these different things. And that had one of the lowest implementations. And when I asked people who, said that they had this on their network or they'd attempted it, how did that go?
Right.
It was pretty grim. Some people, I talked to one person who was like, in the middle of trying to do this, my CTO told me, this is more of just an engineering thought experiment. Most people haven't really done this. He's like, well, you could have told me that earlier, because especially with network segmentation, it's sort of like the unknown unknowns of your network become known, especially
of what's on my network.
And it's like you kind of overturn stones that can cause kind of a cascade of issues. And so most of the people I talked to felt that they were not really in a place where they could do like a full network segmentation project, which I thought was really interesting because it just kind of shows how uneven some of these different pillars of zero trust security are being, implemented.
Right. Well, that brings me, I think, to an interesting point about sort of the real issue with ZTS and now SASE. I think has been an HR issue, and this is not unique to 2021 by any means. It's kind of been discussed for a while, but I think it's really coming to a head in terms of like the IT team realizing they need to implement some of these things, but that there's a complication that they first must overcome, which is that security might sit under general IT security rather than under the IT infrastructure team, or worse than that, it might sit under the general security sort of silo of the company that is the same, sort of folks managing the people who scan your badge in the lobby and stuff like that, right? So I think bringing all of that together under something that makes sense to the IT infrastructure team is the real challenge, right? So,
yeah, and you mentioned IoT. This is another pain point that various people brought up, which is that as smart devices are becoming more prevalent in workplaces, like WAN managers, at the same time as they're trying to do all this stuff of like moving things off premises and everything going into the cloud, they're like, I'm somehow now a facilities manager.
Right, exactly.
You know, and like certain things like, the door network or like the vending machine network, I don't want that to touch anything else going on here. So that like further complicates the network.
Yeah, the concept that we've talked about before, like the shadow IT, right? In the cloudification, the digital transformation, it was often people would adopt some kind of cloud service without checking with network team at all. But now it's like they might even install IoT devices without checking, as long as you can get it on the Wi-Fi or whatever, right? Then,
exactly.
Yeah, and so that I think again it becomes kind of the WAN or IT infrastructure manager is not merely a technologist, but is really kind of a manager of people of HR kind of issues, right? So.
Yeah, and before we move on from this topic, I'm not sure how carefully we need to talk about this, but in terms of SASE, right?
What's out there?
What is SASE? What is SASE not? I talk to people about this because
it's a capacious term, if you will.
Indeed. Because honestly, through my conversation with people, really the conclusion I came to is that at the moment, SASE is a vendor term and not necessarily an enterprise term, right? And it's much more like, we even saw this, many companies that previously had been SD-WAN vendors have rebranded to SASE vendors. And it's sort of like, well, what does this really mean?
Right. Well, just like SD-WAN washing, where if I was in, say, WAN op in 2016, then all of a sudden I became SD-WAN or whatever, right? So, yeah. And not to say that there's not genuine changes in the technology going on there, but, there is a definite response to some marketing and hype here for sure,
Yeah. And one thing I'll be curious to see in this, kind of growing market is one of the things about SASE from the vendor perspective really seems to be like wanting buy-in to be the one-stop shop, not just for SD-WAN and network management, but also for the network security management. And I didn't necessarily hear from anyone of the large enterprises that we talked to who were interested in necessarily biting on that. A lot of them maintain independent relationships with their network vendors and prefer to be able to evaluate them and drop and replace as they see fit, so that they can always keep the best of breed vendor. So I'm curious to see if, this sort of like one-stop shop thing gets adopted by them, or if it's perhaps more aimed at the
later adopters.
Not even the later adopters, but sort of like the mid-size market.
Well, certainly the larger your network, the more endpoints, the more complex it becomes, the more likely you are to need multiple vendors. I think it's also probably a factor. So I spend more time, you spend sort of more time than me talking directly to enterprises in some cases, doing all those interviews for the survey. I spend a little bit more time going to like proof of concepts by the vendors and vendor talks and whatnot. And it was my impression that they are trying really hard to come to market with a sort of full SASE stack and define that, but they haven't yet, right? And so if we see enterprises saying, okay, well, I'm not going to a single provider for this, it might be in part because it doesn't exist yet, right? You know what I mean? So I think as it might develop very much like SD-WAN did, where, like we said before, when you looked at an SD-WAN in 2018, most people were going vendor direct. Their carriers didn't have an SD-WAN offering yet. Now we see a plurality going with some kind of managed service from a carrier or MSP. I think eventually the security thing may congeal there, but we found most people were using like a huge mix of vendors, right?
That's the other thing, is that most people had like 4 or 5 different just network security infrastructure.
Right. Not like piecing together different sort of technologies, but even just like 4 different network security vendors.
Yeah, exactly. And so there's like a lot of issues with like tech debt remediation, because for some of them it's like, well, we're trying to sunset this, but it's on like 2,000 different routers.
Or we acquired this company.
Yeah, that's a huge thing. M&A,
exactly. Yeah.
Bringing in different vendors to your network. So there's just like a lot of that going on as well.
It's going to take a very long time, I think, many years for the dust to settle on all of that, for it to be, oh, this is a thing that I go to, a small number of very large, managed services providers and get. I think that's still a ways off.
Thanks very much for listening. The WAN Manager podcast is brought to you by TeleGeography, a division of Primetrica Incorporated, and is edited and produced by Jane Miller. I wrote the theme song you're listening to right now, and we get administrative canine support from my dog Honeybun, who you might hear chiming in from time to time when the mood strikes her. If you want to learn more about our data, head over to telegeography.com, where you can find our blog that covers many of the topics we hit here, and you can sign up for our WAN Manager newsletter. Until next time, have a great day.